I'm very pleased to introduce Jennifer Roach Lees. Jennifer Roach Lees holds a Master in Divinity as well as a Master's in Counseling Psychology. She is best known for her research into how the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints handles cases of sexual abuse. She has spoken at the annual Fair Conference on this topic, as well as on the dynamics involved in bishops interviewing teenagers alone. Jennifer is a licensed mental health therapist and lives in Utah. So with that, I'll turn the time over to Jennifer.
Thank you for your patience. Good afternoon. I am Jennifer Roach. It is a pleasure and privilege to be with you today. I'm here to talk about an issue that is difficult, and that is how our church, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, handles issues that come up as a result of sexual abuse that happens in the church. Part of why I say this is a difficult issue is it is very emotionally charged. It's hard to talk or read about these things without a lot of big emotions being involved, and we see that in much of the current media that talks about when cases of abuse are brought up in our church. It's an emotional issue. Victims deserve our compassion and our support. And much of how we talk about this issue is intended to give that to them. Today, what I want to do is take a step back from the emotionality of it and talk through how are these things talked about in the media, be able to look at some maybe more critical ways of seeing what's going on, and then look at some of the actual facts that get reported to us in some of the big articles that have come out and say, like, is it true? Is our church some hotbed of sexual abuse? Do we protect abusers? Is the church worried about its reputation in a way that makes it act in deceitful ways that members would be sad to learn about? And much of that is portrayed to us in the media. So we're going to talk about all of that. Ideally, the number of abuse cases would be zero. That is what all of us in this room and probably all of us in the church would hope for. That is not the case. And we're going to talk about kind of where does our church stand in comparison to other similar groups that maybe are dealing with some of the same issues, and what are some of the unique protections that our church offers that you don't actually find in other places. I have a very vested interest in this question. I grew up outside of our church. I grew up in another church. I only joined our church just about 5 years ago. And I am a survivor of sexual abuse from a pastor in the church where I grew up. It feels trite a little bit to say that all abuse is traumatic. It affects a young person's life for years. I have spent much of my life devoted to either treating this in my clinical practice or in researching this. So I was baptized into our church about 5 years ago. How that happened is a much longer story, but it would be no surprise to you to know that I was very interested in how abuse is handled in our church prior to my joining. I imagine that's not the question missionaries usually get, but that was certainly my question. And because I'm not only a survivor of abuse, I'm a mental health therapist, so always curious about how does an organization kind of handle these things when they happen. I've also conducted research with an eye towards identifying systems and best practices to deter abuse. So when I was considering joining our church, I had questions. And while no organization operates perfectly, there's always room for improvements. I have been impressed as a victim, as a therapist, as a researcher by the range of effective systems and practices that are used in our church to protect children. I might see them a tiny bit differently than you do if you are a lifelong member of the church. Because I was able to look at this with kind of some outsider's eyes, I might have seen some things that you did not, or that you do not see in our practices, how they actually are some protections for children. So I want to share my observations with you. So I was rather confused by a recent news report characterizing the church as having a system to protect itself from costly lawsuits by keeping abuse secret at all costs. I thought that just does not line up with what my experience in the church has been. And my personal confusion is not unique, but broader than that. It's not unique to read a news story about any topic and not walk away a little bit dissettled, especially when it comes to how the church handles abuse. These stories are often written with very emotional language, attempting to lead you to a conclusion through your emotions. Sometimes we call that emotional reasoning. So today I'm going to talk to you about two things. One, using critical thinking when reading news stories that are criticisms of the church. I'll use my experience around abuse, but these principles apply broadly. And two, I will give you some of the facts that they tend to get wrong in these cases. First, how can we read about scandalous things in the media while also using critical thinking? Most people writing news stories are not experts in the field. Occasionally, you will find someone who is, but for the most part, they write on a broad variety of topics, and their job is to obtain as many facts as possible, make as much sense as possible, put it into a story, spit it out, move on to the next topic, on which they are also probably not an expert. 5 years ago, my case of sexual abuse was being written about in the newspapers in California, the United States, state of California, and I interacted with lots of different reporters. I found most of them to be really interested in finding out what the truth was, but they're also interested in selling newspapers and getting clicks, and that requires emotional language. Our church is also not easily understood by outsiders. Unless they're committed to digging for some understanding, our church works structurally differently than a lot of other churches, and you'll see what I mean on that in a minute. First principle I want to talk about in reading stories like this is when you're reading a negative news story about the church, watch for language that reveals that they do not quite understand how things work in our church. Here's an example. 2 years ago, an article about abuse was printed by the Associated Press and read rather widely. That article tells a horrific story of abuse in the southwestern United States. It's shocking, it's hard to read. The article and the accompanying video and images use very powerful language with an emotional punch. Every word, every image, every note of music is chosen deliberately to make one point. This church protects abusers. But is it true? If you look carefully beyond the emotional language, you will have some questions. For example, you will see that the reporter calls this abuser an ordained priest. And he appears to compare that to the position a Catholic priest holds. A position surely of power and influence, but the facts of the case are the man was middle-aged, had only ever been given the Aaronic priesthood as a youth, had never been endowed, and never received the Melchizedek priesthood, something quite different than a Catholic priest. There's a big difference there between a grown man who's never moved beyond the Aaronic priesthood that he received at 12 years old, and the man who is a leader of an entire congregation. But the article makes no distinction, just refers to him as a priest of the church. In the article, they're represented as the same thing. This should be a clue to anyone reading who knows anything about our church, that the reporter may have been doing the best he can, and he uses spectacularly well-crafted language. He has some facts wrong there. So the first principle is to look carefully and see beyond the emotion and the good writing to see, does this person actually understand what they are saying? If they don't understand what they are saying, it's hard to take their conclusions at face value. Second principle, do not confuse the edge for the middle. Yes, people in our church have done bad things and caused harm. Of course, that is true. The church is made up of human beings. But what happens is that news articles have a tendency to find a person with a strong opinion and make it seem like they speak for the entire group, or worse, that they speak for the leadership or the doctrine of the church. Though we don't seem to apply the same standard to other groups, if members of the local gardening group had an extreme political opinion, we would not immediately think all people who love to grow roses share that opinion. And we would not immediately think that rose growing has caused their extreme opinions, and all people who grow roses should be treated with suspicion. But in news articles, they do this, and it should give you some pause. You have to step back from the article and look for these tricks. It's really hard to do when the issue carries such high emotion. But it's worth doing so that you are not pulled into that, leaving logic behind. So using those principles, we are going to look at some of the claims. The overarching theme of these claims seems to be the church is a hotbed of abuse and protects abusers at all costs. It's a shocking claim. It isn't true, and I want to explain to you how I know that. Because I spent so much of my life outside of our church, I only converted in my 50s, I can easily see some of the unique practices around child protection. And there are things you may not have thought of. First one, the geographical organization and member number system. I bet you never thought that your member number, something that's printed on your temple recommend or on your record, you've probably never thought of that as something that has anything to do with child protection, but it actually does. Compare that with allowing people to worship wherever they want. Established geographical boundaries provide unique protection by helping leaders and congregants alike be more aware of who attends and who leads and interacts with children. The member number system allows leadership to make a confidential annotation on a person's file that will follow that person from congregation to congregation if they are not safe to be around children. Advocates for safer practices in churches have long encouraged denominations to implement a similar number system. Almost none have. If you are a person who commits a crime against children and you do that in one country and you move to another country, your member record follows you. Your number stays the same. The leaders in your new area will know what has happened as a warning to protect children in that ward. If you're familiar at all with the Catholic Church abuse system, it's exactly turned on its head, where abusers were deliberately moved to hide them. Here, if you have an annotation, there is no hiding. Number two, parental participation and our system of two-deep leadership. Since 2018, the church has ensured a two-deep leadership model, meaning children should not be with just one adult, especially one child and one adult at a church activity. This mandates that at least two adults be present in all activities that involve youth or children. This means if there's a Sunday school class for children or young adults, two adults should be present. The same policy has been increasingly adopted by other churches and organizations working with youth, and for that we are grateful. Additional changes to interviewing policies in the church encourage parents to attend the youth interview with a bishop if they prefer. If a young person wants to speak alone with clergy, which many facilitate young persons speaking candidly about abuse at home, parents or guardians are asked to remain close by. Number three, a system of public callings and sustainings. The calling system of our church serves as another structural safeguard that throttles would-be abusers by making access to young people significantly harder. Simply put, no one can serve alongside children merely by volunteering. They are only asked to serve in such a position after consideration by both male and female church leaders, usually who also have families and children in the congregation. The fact that every new calling is presented for a public sustaining vote in front of the full congregation is also significant. Since everyone has a chance to know about it, and congregants have a chance to object if they know of any reasons to, either publicly or in private. Number four, windows and doors of Sunday school and primary classrooms. The church has now ensured that windows are standard on doors where children are taught, or that doors are left open when possible. This allows for parents to easily monitor their children and classroom activity. Older chapels are receiving retrofitting. Number 5, unpaid bishops leading congregations. Bishops almost always have a history as longtime members of their congregations prior to being asked to serve. The same is true of other church leaders. Since they are all unpaid, there is no financial incentive to protect their ecclesiastical position or guard the ward's bottom line or their own. They also know their role is temporary, and their actions are subject to review by successors and fellow leaders, both male and female, serving with them in the ward. Number 6, a formalized helpline prioritizing victims' safety. However helpful vigilant local leaders are, things could be missed in helping victims. That's why I've been grateful the church has prioritized for 3 decades a dedicated helpline to ensure a consistently high-quality standard of care by connecting lay leaders with experts who can guide them on handling cases skillfully. Yes, these experts seek to help bishops comply with the law, but their first priority is always to protect any victim. When a helpline call is answered, the focus is on safety first. If there is any indication that a child is or may be in imminent danger, authorities are notified immediately, regardless of whether a report is mandatory under applicable law. One of the women who has worked on the helpline, Kate Taylor Layak, likewise an abuse survivor, describes other experts staffing the helpline as diligent, competent, compassionate, and deeply committed to the work of protecting kids from abuse. Number 5, direct female supervision. In my observation, it is also significant to have multiple women in formal leadership positions working with Latter-day Saint girls and young women throughout their adolescence. From monitoring the children in primary to the ministering and care of leaders in the Young Women and Relief Society organizations, this ensures additional female mentorship at every stage of the life of a young woman, those who are statistically more vulnerable to abuse. Number 8, the safeguard of confession. Too often, commentators quickly assume that mandatory reporting is the one fail-safe solution to deter abuse. Why, it's clear why this has become a push for many activists. Scholars focused on mandating reporting have cautioned against this simplistic conclusion. One study, for example, found measurably fewer confirmed reports of child maltreatment in the 11 states requiring clergy to report all or some of the time, compared to states without the requirement, suggesting that the requirement itself might keep it from being discussed by actual perpetrators. What people may not understand is that by forcing clergy to become mandated reporters, we could inadvertently keep even more abuse hidden as abuse goes even further underground. Likewise, it's possible that a space for open confession may provide additional protection to victims by ensuring space exists for clergy to encourage bad actors to turn themselves in, or helping to catch and deter concerning behaviors that could spiral. Number 9, 4 decades of repeated leadership training. After my baptism into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I was struck to learn how long the church has been educating members directly about deterring abuse, far longer than any other church I am aware of. Dating back to a 1985 training booklet addressing child abuse, the text emphasized the importance of trusting victims and taking their words seriously, and compassionately connecting them with professional help. It also instructed leaders to know and follow reporting requirements in their state or country. The Church Handbook for Leaders and Members, going back at least 2 decades, has read, In instances of abuse, the first responsibility of the church is to help those who have been abused and to protect those who may be vulnerable to future abuse. Number 10, membership-wide training, especially for those working with youth. A mandatory online training course was launched in 2019 for all adults who interact with children and youth in their church assignments. And the challenging topic of abuse has been repeatedly brought up in our faith's general conference. In my experience, the frequency and consistency with abuse has been addressed is remarkable. In addition to these safeguards against abuse, I've been struck at how receptive the church has been to emerging practices. While it's impossible to say how much potential abuse has been thwarted, it's almost certain that in combination, these practices have acted for decades as a strong deterrent. This is why I wasn't surprised in my own analysis to find rates measurably lower in Boy Scout of America troops associated with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I've written and spoken about this research in depth in other places. See my FAIR 2023 talk detailing my process and results, but I will give you a brief overview here. As you are probably aware, the church partnered with the Boy Scouts of America for decades. And depending on the decade, 30 to 40% of those troops were affiliated with our church. And rather fortunately for my research, the Boy Scouts as an organization have kept detailed records of abuse for over 85 years. Thousands of these records are publicly available online. The Los Angeles Times maintains a database where you can read all of the case files yourself if you were so inclined. These files list each abuser, some demographic information about them, their crimes, how they were discovered, and how they were handled. The files also list the abuser's religious affiliation. This is where it gets interesting. In my research, I read through thousands of these files and noted which abusers were members of our church, other churches, or no church at all. And because we know that 30 to 40% of troops were affiliated with our church, we might assume 30 to 40% of the abusers were affiliated with our church. It's not true, though. The actual number, the actual percentage of abusers affiliated with our church is 5%. You would have expected roughly 35%. It's not, it's 5%. Compared to 40% of our troops belonging to our church. Another way to say that is that there's a 75% less abuse than you would expect to find in our church based on the numbers alone. I find that striking and reassuring. While any amount of abuse is horrific, it is reassuring to me to see the church operate in a way that is reducing abuse. I have to wonder how many other young people would be protected if these practices were used widely by other churches. These are the kinds of things that I would hope journalists and others would pay attention to in seeking to deter abuse, help victims, or speak about our church. In addition to raising our voices against abuse and telling the stories of victims which deserve to be heard, we also should spread greater awareness of the practices and systematic safeguards that protect the precious dignity and safety of all of God's children. Thank you for your time. I will take questions.
So you obviously had a lot of experience and knowledge of working with other churches there. And what you're saying, I mean, I'm just summarizing here a little bit. What you're saying is the expected amount of abuse in our church is just significantly lower than what the other churches have. So what are some of these other churches that you've been affiliated with, what kind of safeguards, just out of curiosity, what kind of safeguards are they putting in place?
Yeah, it really depends upon the church. There's a wide variety of safeguards. Background checks are one of the things that comes up a lot. If you're kind of interested in this area, the current silver bullet or thing that will solve everything right now is background checks. Here's the problem. Background checks only find something if it's in your background. Meaning, if you have a conviction, if you even have charges on an abuse case, a background check can find that. Most abusers are never, ever caught, let alone charged. Maybe 3% of abuse cases ever have any kind of legal record associated with them. So the problem with background checks is another church might hand a background check to someone, they fill it out, they run it through whatever system they're running it through, it comes back, no issues. So the church leadership is able to tell parents, there's no issues with this person, they're completely safe around children. Well, all a clean background check means is nothing was discovered. It doesn't actually mean nothing has happened. So people really over-rely on those and try to assure parents, all of these people are fine, when that's actually coming to a conclusion that a background check can't actually draw out. Another practice that other churches use is, it has to do with our calling system, right? Is you can walk in the door of a lot of churches and say, hey, I'm new and I'd like to volunteer with the kindergartners. And in a month, maybe you're sitting in the kindergarten classroom, and you can't do that in our church. You have to wait to receive a calling. If you're someone who is hoping to commit abuse, there are churches that are way easier to get access to the children than ours is. Those are really my two biggest reasons why some of our practices are working, and they're sort of not quite, in my opinion, being used in right places elsewhere.
So I have a two-part question. First one, let's say you're talking to a young woman or a young man, I guess, and you realize or recognize that their abuse has been going on. What should you do?
Yeah, most adults that I know of, I'm sure you're the same way, feel like if a child or a teenager came to me and told me abuse was happening to them, I would do whatever I had to do to protect them. It's kind of adults' responsibility, especially as we look to kids in our church or teenagers in our ward. The problem is, kids and teenagers do not generally disclose abuse like that. They don't make an appointment with you and sit you down and say, I'd like to tell you what so-and-so has been doing to me. They say things that kind of come out sideways, kind of weird. They make a weird comment. The adult who's paying attention might need to follow up on that comment. They're very, very unlikely to come out and just say it directly. Most abuse is not discovered by a child confessing, by the abuser being caught in the act or with evidence in some way. They're found out because a kid says something that doesn't make sense to an adult. And an adult goes, wait a minute, how would you know that? Or why are you saying this? And they ask some follow-up questions. What that means for you, other adults, is sometimes you have to be brave and ask the next question. It's easy to let an odd thing that a child or a teenager says just kind of flitter away because you don't want to be seen as the one who's asking some inappropriate questions. Why are you asking this child about this? But that is how abuse is discovered. If you figure that out, or if a child came and actually confessed to you, I don't actually know the system in Italy, and I apologize for that. In the United States, yeah. In the US, we would say, you call Child Protective Services, you call the police, you notify authorities. Child abuse is a crime. We think of it as like a bad thing that happens, but it's a criminal act. So notifying authorities.
So first one here. When a member of a community confesses a sexual abuse on their own kids, are bishops clearly instructed only to keep the confessions in their office and treat the issue spiritually, or also to encourage the members to turn themselves in and make sure to treat the issue legally, since sexual abuse is a crime condemned by the law of the land?
It's a fantastic question, and the answer depends upon your area. There are some states in which, if it's confessed to a bishop, they have 24 hours to call the legal authorities. There are other places where that's not the law. In terms of what the church wants bishops and other leaders to do, protection of the child is always number one. There's a big case that was in the media a couple years ago, and one of the complaints in that case was, two different bishops just sort of sat on their hands, knowing full well some kids were being abused at home, and they didn't do a thing. And if you look into the actual records, the court records, they're available online, you can read the court documents, the bishops did not know what the media says that they knew. They were under an entirely different impression, even though some of the information came from the abuser himself. The bishops had many actual reasons to believe the kids were safe, so there was no action taken to remove those kids from the home because there wasn't any reason to believe that they were unsafe. That turned out to be following the legal process in that state. And in other states, that would not have been the legal response. So it does get a little bit confusing.
I know I was a bishop at one time, and I know that I was encouraged to protect the child. Mm-hmm. Should the bishop's office door have a window under current policies or not?
That is a fantastic question. My understanding is that is not the policy, in part because adults would like privacy with their bishop, and it's at odds with what might be best for children. And in the history of how child abuse has been looked at and kind of dealt with over the centuries and decades, not just in our church, but in broader society, that is always the tension, the needs of adults versus the needs of children. In my opinion, not speaking for the church, it would be ideal if every door in the chapel had windows on it, and you can immediately see the problems with that. We don't want windows in the bathroom doors, right? We don't want there to be people looking in when an adult wants their privacy, and we want to be able to see when children do. Should there be windows in the bishop's door? It's not my call, but if I was voting, I would say yes.
What happened to your abuser?
The man who abused me, this was not in our church, in case you didn't hear that part, he kept his job. He got hired by more churches. It was written about in the newspapers in quite a bit of detail. About 5 years ago, the church who was currently employing him says, it doesn't matter to us. That is the most common outcome for, at least outside of our church, for when a leader abuses someone, is that they keep their job. The difference there, of course, we have non-paid clergy. In other churches, that's their full-time profession. He kept his job. He still has his job. He's still a pastor.
So let's step beyond for a moment, and all the legal things have taken care of. And obviously, I want to also point out it's not just the bishop's responsibility to call the legal authorities, it's everybody's responsibility. But let's say you have a young woman in your group or a young man, and abuse has happened, and now you're just dealing with them. What should you bring up or not bring up, or how should you communicate with them?
Yeah, it's a great question. Maybe try to think of it like if you were providing first aid. If you came upon the scene of a car accident, you wouldn't say, this person's leg is broken, I will set their leg right here on this side of the road. You don't have the tools, you probably don't have the expertise to do so, but maybe you could apply pressure to the bleeding, right? You could call the ambulance, you could maybe help them because they've gone into shock or something. The kind of corollary in talking about abuse: provide them comfort, provide them knowledge that Heavenly Father knows about them and sees them, provide them a spiritual blessing, either a priesthood blessing or some kind of spiritual encouragement. It's going to be a long road for them, and they're going to need lots of that. Maybe think of your involvement as sort of spiritual or emotional first aid in that moment.
I appreciate your time. I know this is a sensitive subject, and especially for you, I'm sure. So I really appreciate this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.